Have you ever worked in a team that's just clicked, where everyone has had each other's backs and you felt like you've truly belonged? What if you could create that on purpose? It turns out you can, and it's not just about being nice. It's about leadership, clarity, and knowing what gets in the way. Hi, I'm Sarah McGuinness, founder of Revolutionaries of Wellbeing, or ROW, and I'm on a mission to break burnout culture for good. This podcast is packed with practical ideas to help you create a healthier, more supportive workplace and look after your own wellbeing too. In this episode, I'm joined by Dr. Emma Clarke, a Kiwi researcher and specialist currently based in Europe.
Because if you're saying one thing, if you're saying, look, we don't want you to work after 6 o'clock, yet you're sitting there at 9 o'clock sending emails at 10 o'clock at night, you're not role modelling the behaviours that create a psychologically safe environment.
Emma's just wrapped up her PhD on leadership, psychological safety and wellbeing in professional services, and she's now channeling that research into a new startup. We dive into her key findings, including a practical 3-factor model of psychological safety that's incredibly timely. Whether you're leading a team or working to shift culture in your organisation, there's something in this for you. Let's dive in.
Thank you, Sarah. Thank you for having me. It's really great to be here. It's really great to be on the other side of the PhD and talking about my findings and the practical implications for organisations. I think it's really important that I've come away from this PhD with something that is tangible that I can use. My background is in marketing. I had a 25-year career in marketing. I had some corporate experience in my 20s, and then I had 2 marketing businesses, a consultancy and an agency, which I ran in New Zealand for 15 years. And in my early 40s, I experienced burnout, and I had a medical event which kind of prompted me to think about, what am I doing with my life? I've got another 20 years of work in me. I don't want to keep doing marketing. I sort of became very cynical about the work I was doing, which is unfortunate because I'm not like that now. But, the burnout, all the symptoms of burnout, I didn't realize at the time. In reflecting back, doing my PhD, I realized that is what had happened. And I decided to go back to my roots, back to my undergraduate degree, which I did in the late 90s, which was in psychology. I went back to university. I went to Auckland Uni and I did a postgraduate diploma in science with the view that I would do a master's. Went to do the master's and ended up with my 3 amazing supervisors at the University of Canterbury, advised me and encouraged me to do a PhD. And I ended up doing my PhD remotely. The topic that I wanted to cover, or what I wanted to look at was, I had these experiences in my 20s working in mostly male-dominated organisations, IT companies, very hierarchical organisations. I was in situations myself of negative situations, and I observed situations as well, bullying type, incivility and some harassment type situations, things that shouldn't have been happening. It was part of the reason why I started my marketing businesses, because I decided I don't want to work in corporates. I want to work for myself. So it did have a lasting effect. It drove me to become self-employed. When I got to doing my PhD and I was talking to my supervisors and we were thinking about a topic, I had some ideas, and one of those ideas was looking at law firms. And I have lots of friends and family members and, people in my life who are lawyers and ex-lawyers and ex-partners. And I heard lots of stories about this environment, this law firm environment. Around that time as well, we just had the Russell McVeigh drama, I guess you'd call it. Very terrible events. For those who don't know, Russell McVeigh is a large New Zealand law firm, one of the 5 or 6 largest. They'd received a number of complaints from younger female interns. It was around unethical behaviour, bullying, harassment. by senior partners in the firm, and it escalated. It wasn't addressed adequately. Unfortunately for Russell McVeigh, it was around the same time of the Me Too movement, so there was a lot of media attention on them, and they initiated an independent investigation with Dame Margaret Baisley, who revealed this toxic workplace culture, and there was just a lot of media attention, and it was all around that same time I was deciding what topic to do for my PhD. And I decided, this was a really interesting environment to look into and to try to understand what's going on. Why are young people leaving? Why are these things happening to young women? Some of what was happening, not everything that was happening with these young interns, but some aspects of what was happening resonated with me in my experience in my 20s. And I just, discussed it with my supervisors, and we decided that psychological safety is potentially a good topic to be looking into in relation to this context, the legal profession. There hadn't really been any other research other than internal surveys, which a lot of the law firms do. So that's kind of where it all came from and where it started, I guess.
And let's start with definitions, because I always think it's a really good place to, first of all, know that we're all on the same page. So how would you define psychological safety?
Amy Edmondson defined psychological safety in 1999, which is around the same time that I was doing my undergraduate degree. She was doing her PhD at Harvard, and she's now a professor there. And she has kind of brought psychological safety back to life. She's defined it as a belief or a perception among team members who respect and trust each other that they're safe to take interpersonal risks, intellectual risks, make mistakes, voice concerns, and speak up about things that they might be worried about without the fear of retribution or negative repercussions to their career. And so that's probably the best definition, but it's really important that people understand that psychological safety is a perception that employees have. So, one team can have a really high perception of psychological safety, and one team within the same organisation can have a low perception of psychological safety. So it's not static across an organisation, which means what that's saying is that leaders play a really vital, really pivotal role in building psychological safety. And they do this consciously or unconsciously through their behaviour. And so in really stressful environments, which is what I did my research in, high demand, high stress environments where people are under a lot of pressure, sometimes behaviours, leadership behaviours, the leaders will become potentially unaware of how they're behaving and how they're role modelling. That can create positive or negative environments for employees.
And I can imagine that there almost must be a scale, because I'm thinking of the dream team that we'd all love to be part of that was psychologically safe. And I'd love to know, if you were in a dream team, how would you know, what would that feel like? What would you experience? And then I imagine there must be a sliding scale of little passive behaviours starting to come in through to full-blown toxic, terrible, hideous. What do you, does that sound, or what's your take on that?
It might be good just to clarify as well the misconceptions about psychological safety first, because, sometimes when I'm speaking to people about psychological safety, they talk about being polite or being nice and avoiding difficult conversations. It's about being comfortable. And actually, it's not about that. It's actually about being able to be comfortable, to have difficult conversations, to be able to have a different opinion and to be able to speak up about it and have a debate, to feel included, although that's not a precursor to psychological safety. But I've got a different view to some other people, but I feel safe to talk about that. It's like if you think about sitting in a meeting and someone wants to talk about or speak up about an uncomfortable or unconventional idea that might not have been done previously in the organisation. And also when team members, they want to discuss a mistake, rather than just not talking about it, let's talk about what went wrong. Let's talk about how we could have done that differently and what we've learned from it. What are the positive outcomes of that failure or that mistake? Having these open sort of disagreements, I think, constructive disagreements, these things, all these types of environments just lead to better decision making. It leads to better, diversity of thought. A dream team is really a team where everybody has their own view, but we can all come together, we can listen to each other, we can be open and honest, and we can think about what other people are saying, but we can come to a decision together, and we can address difficult issues together, and we can challenge the status quo. I think that's really important. Risk-taking, making mistakes, all of those things are part of learning, and they're also a part of building psychological safety and building resilience. And that's where innovation comes from, and creativity and performance. If you're in an environment where you feel you can't say anything, can't give your opinion for various reasons, because you're young, because you've only been there a year, because you're sometimes because you're female, your cultural differences might mean that it's not appropriate for you to speak up to somebody who's more senior. It's actually about being a little bit uncomfortable. It's not about being polite and nice to people. It's, of course you want to be polite and nice, but you need to be honest and give constructive feedback and be open to that.
Speaking of being uncomfortable, because I know you did your research in those law firms, what was that journey like, getting the law firms on board? Because I'm thinking for many organisations, in practice, when you ask these things, they're scared of the big rocks you're going to kick over. So how did that go for you?
I think because of the timing of the research, they probably felt like this was an opportunity to perhaps understand a little bit more about psychological safety and what it is, and where their firm fits in the bigger group, I guess. And obviously, when you do research through university, it's, the ethical sign-offs and, it's all very confidential. Everybody who participated is completely anonymous. None of the names of the firms have ever been mentioned. So, really making sure that people felt safe, that this was completely anonymous and confidential. And that was the first kind of hurdle. I actually approached, I think, 20 law firms directly. I approached CEOs and HR directors. Some of those firms participated and others didn't. So I ended up with 12. And then I approached law societies and all the law associations. And I got individuals from those groups to participate in my surveys. I did my surveys first. I had 250 participants in my surveys, and I measured their perspectives and feelings about psychological safety and well-being and a bunch of other things at 2 time points, 4 weeks apart. And so I had to measure the same individuals at 2 time points just to look for changes and better statistical validity. I ended up with, I think, 90 participants who did the survey twice. So it was really actually quite a struggle to get people to participate. And I think what happened with Russell McVeigh and all the media attention really scared people, and they didn't want to be in the media. Fair enough. Because actually lots of organisations, not just law firms, have poor some law firms have very good psychological safety, but it's not just about law firms. It's all organisations that operate under specific structures. And yeah, it was a bit of a struggle. I had a lot of participants who had something to say. The people who participated had experiences, negative experiences, but also positive experiences that they wanted to share. And in my surveys, I had open-ended kind of spaces for them to fill out a little bit more information if they wanted to. And many participants made comments that they were thinking about leaving or they'd already resigned. And that was what kind of pushed me into the interview study, which was the second and third study, where I started digging in a little bit deeper to try to understand, why are people leaving? Why do they want to leave? Why is psychological safety low in some firms and not in others? What's going on? So that the second and the third studies, I was able to ask some of my survey participants if they'd participate in the interviews. I had 35 participants, which is quite a good number, partners and employees, and they were very honest and open. And I think my own experiences helped them to really be honest. I think I got quite a lot of content and detail that perhaps I wouldn't have got if I hadn't have had some of those experiences myself.
Before we dive into, because I want to go in shortly into your research and what you actually found, I just want to pick up on one of the questions in the chat, which is fantastic, around how do we compare in New Zealand, given that often we're reluctant to give feedback and have hard conversations. You know, as Kiwis, we're really known for dancing around the bush, especially compared to other more forthright cultures.
Yes, that's true. What I'm advising now, I've started a consulting business, and I know, Sarah, you and I have discussed this, but when individuals are working in a psychologically unsafe environment, they will not provide honest responses to internal surveys. And a lot of these organisations will do a pulse survey. The big organisations, they'll do pulse surveys once a year, wellbeing surveys. And if you don't feel psychologically safe to speak up or to raise any issues, then you will just answer the questions like you're supposed to. What that does is it means that leaders are left completely unaware of why they have high turnover, why they have people going on stress leave, and what are the real issues that are affecting employee perceptions. It's actually really hard to measure and monitor psychological safety unless you have a third-party, independent, completely separate kind of organisation or tool that can help you get that information. That's one of the reasons I'm in Amsterdam, is I'm in a startup accelerator program, and we're developing an AI tool, which is based on my 3-factor model of psychological safety. And it will help organisations to identify some of the challenges that might be preventing them from building psychological safety. And it will also help them to assess some of the resources that employees need in these really high stress, high demand working environments. How do employees cope? How do they how do they remain being resilient and successful and high performance, being high performers? How do they keep doing that? What are the tools and the resources that the employer can provide? And how does the employee access those tools? There are other tools available. There are HR analytics tools. There are wellbeing tools that integrate some aspects of psychological safety. There's also, you can look at, if you're in an organisation, you can look at behavioural factors. How often are people speaking up in a team? Is there a dominant voice that's usually taking over? How are we fostering inclusion? How are we creating an environment where people feel included and safe to have a diverse voice? And, what are the things that we're doing to promote open communication? And for me, one of the key signals in an organisation, if there's poor psychological safety, is high turnover. If your organisation does not retain top talent, they're leaving, they're going to competitors, they're going to other industries, they're starting their own businesses. That sends a signal that there's something going on within the culture that's not working.
Let's dive in then to your model.
So let me just share my screen. So as part of my research, I uncovered 3 key factors that influence psychological safety. First factor that I identified was that there are barriers and blind spots in organisations, and also that there are specific leadership behaviours that affect the work environment. And when organisations identify the barriers and the blind spots, and they try to identify, what are these cultural and structural issues that might be affecting perceptions of psychological safety in the work environment. Leaders can often be unaware of what these barriers and blind spots are. And as an example, in my research and in my data, I found that in law firms, hierarchy and the partnership model of leadership is a potential barrier, and that using billable hours as a measure of performance is a barrier. Gender stereotypes, unconscious biases, and one really important one was these differing perspectives about why people are leaving. So leaders felt that people were leaving because of high workload and they weren't coping, whereas employees had a different perspective about why people were leaving. So if you, as a leader, have different perspectives and don't really know what your employees think, then that's a blind spot. And so when leaders become aware of these blind spots and these barriers, they can behave in ways that might counteract any negative perceptions people have of the workplace. And how do they do this? They do this through their behaviour. Law firms have said to me, well, we can't change our model. We can't change our billable hours model. We can't change the hierarchy. I say, okay, that's fine, but can you change your behaviour? Can you be more emotionally intelligent? Can you learn about emotional intelligence skills and empathy and, recognising when people aren't coping and addressing it? Don't just let it fester. Unfortunately, I think that's what happened with Russell McVeigh. There were things going on and they just let it fester. Being receptive to feedback. Some of these organisations, you, as a leader, you give feedback to your employees, but the employees can't give feedback to you. So 360 feedback, being open to that. And then the most important behaviour, I think, is positive role modelling. Role modelling all of these positive behaviours back to the wider team. Because if you're saying one thing, if you're saying, look, we don't want you to work after 6 o'clock, yet you're sitting there at 9 o'clock sending emails at 10 o'clock at night, you're not role modelling the behaviours that create a psychologically safe environment. And these behaviours have been found to improve well-being, performance, retention, creativity, innovation, and that's what I found in my research as well. The third factor is this access to resources that help employees to cope with stress. So when you're working in these really high demand, high stress environments, employers often provide resources like working from home, flexible working arrangements, autonomy. There are leader support. There are these resources which organisations can provide to help you cope. But employees are all different. So, we have different genders, we have different ages, different generations, different cultures. So we all access, and these resources are made available, but we access them differently depending on our own experiences. And so what I found in my research is that women in law firms may not have the same access to resources as men, and men may use time differently. So it's important to note here that this isn't about, necessarily having a go at men. It's just about trying to illustrate how we're all different, and that our backgrounds, our experiences and who we are impact our perceptions of the environment and how we might use these resources. So there isn't a one size fits all, to how these resources should be applied in an organisation. My research indicated that men in law firms, if they're given the resource of flexible working arrangements, for example, what this says to them is, great, I can work all day and then I'll go home and I'll work all night. It just means I can work more hours. And when you combine that with the billable hours mechanism of performance management, you're driving a behaviour that says the longer you work, the more hours you spend at work, the more you'll be rewarded. The higher up you'll go, the more money you'll make. And what it says to women is, if you have flexible working, because women have the lion's share of the domestic responsibilities, and that's a fact, what happens is that women see it as an opportunity to pick up the kids from school, put the washing on, get the dinner ready. And what it does for women is it means they work less hours in comparison to the men because they're doing all these other domestic chores. They are less likely to move up the hierarchy and get the promotions. And so it's sort of reinforcing a stereotypical pattern of work when you combine flexible working or work-life balance with billable hours. So I think the point I'm trying to make here is that as an organisation, when you look at your structure, the cultural and structural issues within your organisation, and then you look at your resources, you've got to make sure that it's mapping out well, that it's matching. If you provide these great resources at the right time, when they're stressed, when employees are stressed and dealing with lots of work, then it helps their ability to cope, and it leads to improved well-being, performance, retention, innovation, all of those things. It also helps them to move on from stressful events. So it builds their resilience, and they're more likely to stay. And we want the best performers to stay. If we don't provide these resources as leaders, as organisations, because we're stressed ourselves, we just are trying to get the work done, then if our employees don't have access to these resources, then they won't cope. Their perceptions of the environment will be unsafe. They won't tell anybody. And men especially, been shown time and time again, men are less likely to speak up if they're struggling, which leads to burnout. We have these poor wellbeing outcomes, poor performance, and a big increase in turnover. That's kind of the model, the three factors, they all work together. Every organisation is different, but these findings apply to law firms in any Western context that has hierarchy, that uses billable hours.
It's really fascinating, and I can see how they all interlink. And I'm thinking there must be some other factors that almost sit underneath. So, for example, the leadership development training, because so many leaders don't actually get any formal support or even trust. I was thinking for people to trust that if they ask for flexible work, that they're not going to be punished for doing so. So did you see some of those other things come through as well?
No.
Oh, interesting. Good. I think it's good.
The questions. No, I haven't. Should I have a look? Okay.
Oh, yes, so the leadership development training it's certainly something I've seen over time, that so many leaders end up in their roles, right person, right time, sink or swim, good luck to you, choose your own adventure in terms of development.
Yeah. Well, yeah, I mean, in law firms, one of the things that came through in my research is you are promoted if you bring in a lot of money. So if you're bringing in a lot of clients and you've got good relationships and you're building a team, you'll get promoted. So you could be 25, 26, 27 years old, and you could get promoted to partner. And a big reason for that is they don't want to lose you. They want to keep you. So they pay you more. And they call it the golden handcuffs. I'm sure that's in I've heard it in IT as well. They lock you in, and I think women feel less social pressure and less pressure from family and society and, the way our society is structured. Women feel less pressure to stay in an environment like that, and men feel a lot more pressure to stay. So if they're stressed and struggling and they're not asking for help, they're getting paid loads of money and they're a high performer, they're more likely to stay, and they don't want to. In many cases, they might not want to. And the pressure of being the primary breadwinner for the family, there's these social pressures that kind of, work and personal, they overlap, right? You don't go to work and then go home and it all finishes. You're still that person. And as a lawyer, as a partner of a law firm, it's part of your identity. So there's a lot of pressure to stay in those roles and keep earning all that money and providing for your family, but also it's the it's part of their identity, and they've worked so hard to get there. Whereas women, and there's a very high turnover of women in law firms all over the world. That's a global issue. It's a big problem. And they want to figure out this, how do we address this issue of women? And I think it's the same in IT. Women in IT, there's lots of groups now. I met a startup yesterday. She's developed a tool to get more women in tech, and I know there are a lot of women's groups that are trying to encourage that. And there's just some of these pressures from outside of the workplace as well, which keep us in these sometimes toxic or negative environments that we don't want to be in.
On that note, do you see generational differences? Because a lot of those midlifey things are pressured. It's kind of that time of your life when you're building careers, sinking careers, you have the highest probably amount of debt you have in your life, you're caring older, younger generations and trying to deal with really difficult, stressful jobs like you're describing. Do you see differences or was there not a difference?
Yeah. No, definitely. So Gen Z and Gen Alpha have a completely different perspective about work. They go into a job, they're looking for work-life balance, they want flexible working, they want autonomy, they want diversity and inclusion. It's highly regarded. Salary is not the same level of priority as it used to be. The expectations around culture have really shifted for the younger generation. My generation, my parents' generation, it was all about working hard, working hard. Yeah, I do wonder, and I've talked about this with my husband, if some of the younger, the Gen Zs, the Gen Alphas, perhaps their expectations have changed because they're potentially going to be inheriting what their parents have done, and perhaps they don't have the same level of drive. I don't know. There's definitely a difference and a change, and I think it's great. I think organisations have to adapt and adjust and change their models if they want to attract and retain the best talent. And honestly, a lot of these really talented people are women. Sorry, but the highest marks, were the people coming out of university. I know in law schools, the best talent is often women. So how do we as organisations harness that? And I think organisations have to look at changing how they operate and what they and their models and how they reward people.
Well, let's go to that now. Let's talk, first of all, at an organisation point of view, and then we'll go to talking about what individuals can do. So what are your tips for organisations wanting to embrace the 3-factor model?
Is this when I can talk about this product that we're developing?
You should.
So we are developing a product that will specifically help organisations using this 3-factor model. And it's going to help leaders identify these barriers that are preventing them from building psychological safety. And I think that's the key thing. If people are going to go away from this webinar, they need to go away and they have to look at the cultural and structural issues or challenges within their organisation that might be preventing them from getting honest responses from people, and it might be contributing to turnover. So what are those barriers in law firms? Billable hours, hierarchy. I think unconscious biases is a really big one. Really hard to extract that information internally. And I would suggest, going away and looking at what are some unconscious biases that could be occurring in your organisation. And I think using professionals, experts who are trained in this area, organisational psychologists and people who understand this type, who have skills at doing this type of work, that's the first step, trying to understand those barriers. And then the second step is looking at, what are the resources that we provide to our employees? Even things like stand-up desks. There's a whole list of resources that we're putting into our tool, our AI tool, that some people will access and some people won't. Autonomy, for example. Some people, they want autonomy. They want to go and do their own thing, depending on their job role, depending on their personality, depending on their previous experiences. Whereas others find autonomy to them means I've got no leader support. I never see my leader. They've given me this autonomy, but I don't feel supported. Depending on an individual's experiences and where they are in their career, some of these tools will be used or will not be used. Trying to map out what are the resources in our organisations that we have, and what are we offering, and what are people using? I think that's where an AI tool or a tech-based tool comes in to help organisations do that anonymously and confidentially, so that the individual feels safe that they can really say what they think. The leader behaviours as well. We talked about emotional intelligence, empathy, self-awareness. Those are things that can be learned. And as you mentioned before, Sarah, some leaders don't get any training. And in law firms, there's not a lot of leadership training before you become a leader. Some law firms, they do. They start really early. And I know the Law Society are trying to do that. Really learning about how to put yourself in the shoes of other people, and, that emotional intelligence skills and capability, I think, is really important. And, a lot of the partners in my research, the really good ones, the really successful ones that had high-performing teams, and, there's lots of research. Google did a study on this as well. The leaders have very high emotional intelligence. They are able to tap into experiences and situations that they've had in their life, not just at work, but in their life. If you're promoting someone to leadership position at 25, 27, 28, maybe this is just my view, maybe they haven't had enough life experience to have built emotional intelligence. Maybe I'm wrong. It depends on the individual, but I feel that that's one of the kind of key things the key behaviours that leaders can think about. If they're role modelling these behaviours, then their teams will feel safe.
I want to go then to just asking for individuals. So there'll be many people on this call who are in, say, wellbeing manager roles, HR roles, or just someone in a work environment who feels passionately about this and wants to try and make some change. What would you suggest they do?
It's about sort of breaking down those barriers, isn't it? And being really supportive. What you should do is go away and have a look at possibly a course on psychological safety, understanding what it is, because it's actually really hard to build. It's about organisational culture, and it's not something that you just go and do a course and suddenly you'll have it. But building your awareness and understanding about how to build it and what it is and how easy it is to break. One person can destroy psychological safety in an organisation. And talk about it with your teams, talk about things that have happened and be vulnerable and describe situations in your career and your life that have impacted you, when it's appropriate, of course, and lead the way, role model what it's like to be a little bit vulnerable, and role model honesty and openness and risk-taking, perhaps. Encourage these ideas that are a little bit left field, encourage people to talk about any ideas that they have. It could be a particular project or it could be something else. I think it's all about that role modelling, behaving in a way that others see, I'm not going to be working really late. I'm not going to be sending emails really late, and be authentic.
Thanks again for joining us today. If you found this discussion valuable and you're hungry for more ideas, head to the Revolutionaries of Wellbeing website at rowwellbeing.com. That's rowwellbeing.com. Here you can join the revolution, explore more resources, events and tips to help you break burnout culture for good, and you can register to attend our live recordings and be part of the conversation on the day. To those in our network, thanks again, and we look forward to catching up with you really soon.